It is 6:30, so we will go ahead and call the meeting to order. Mr. Cusick, would you please perform roll call?
Mrs. Best.
Present.
Mrs. Davis.
Present.
Mrs. Ebbing-Skinner is absent. Ms. Harless.
Present.
Mrs. Hudson.
Present. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. My name is Nikki Hudson. I have the privilege of serving as this year's board president. To my far left is Kelly Davis, our board vice president. Amber Ebbing-Skinner is traveling for a work conference. Mr. Cusick is our treasurer. To my right, Dr. Bowers, our superintendent, board member Stephanie Harless, and board member, Jennifer Best. If you'll please join us for the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
May I please have a motion to approve our agenda for tonight's meeting?
So moved. Second.
Any questions or comments? And there are no changes. Would you please call for the vote?
Mrs. Best.
Yes.
Mrs. Davis.
Yes.
Ms. Harless.
Yes.
Mrs. Hudson.
Yes. Motion carries, and this brings us to our recognition. If I could please receive a motion to recognize Brianna Abbott for being named Ohio High School Counselor of the Year by the Ohio School Counselors Association.
So moved. Second.
Will you please call for the vote?
Ms. Davis.
Yes.
Ms. Harless.
Yes.
Mrs. Hudson.
Yes.
Mrs. Best.
Yes.
Congratulations. And Jennifer, I think you're
Okay.
going to take the lead
I'm going
with
to take this on.
recognition.
I am so honored and thrilled that we get to celebrate Brianna's recognition as the High School Counselor of the Year by the Ohio School Counselor Association. She is so deserving of this work for her outstanding service to our students and their families. She'll be recognized for this award at the association's annual conference the end of this month. So Brianna and Mr. Thomas, if you could come on up. Let's see, I think it's working. I'm going to say a few words and then have the principal, Mr. Thomas, say a few words. But Brianna is a high school counselor at Worthington Kilbourne High School, and she has been there for 18 years, which I can't believe. I'm sure she can't believe either. My son, Brandon, had her as his guidance counselor when she first came to Kilbourne, and we were so fortunate to have her. Brandon said she was great at really connecting with every student and listening to all the students, and they all appreciated her help and guidance so much at school. He also says congrats and well deserved, because I've been texting with him today, so he was excited too. And we are just so lucky to have you here. I am going to have Mr. Thomas say a couple words.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm honored to be standing next to Brianna. I think her most popular title, though, in our school is Lexi's mom, our therapy dog. So Brianna, what she does for students is she lets them feel seen, valued, and heard. And I think the biggest compliment I could pay her is that she does that for all kids that walk through the door. And lastly, I think she would be embarrassed to have all those accolades said about her, but she also is a member of a team, and she works really hard to make sure that all of the team members in the counseling center are focused on students and their growth and development, academically, physically, and emotionally. So we're lucky to have Brianna.
I was going to mention the dog if you didn't. Will you just tell us a couple words, a little bit about bringing the dog to school and how the kids react, and anything else you want to say too? But
Yeah,
that's
so
just so fascinating.
Lexi is very much the most popular staff member in our building. She is loved, and she loves to love on people too. So she's actually back at we have a meeting happening currently with our pre-apprenticeship partnerships happening right now, and Lexi's there even though I'm not, and was getting lots of attention as I was leaving too. But you know, when we can make Kilbourne a home for our students, that's what Lexi helps us to do. And so a student might not feel comfortable coming in and necessarily thinking that they're going to tell you what's happening for them in their life, but as they sit there and start petting the dog, it's amazing. So we've been really lucky to have the incredible leadership of all of you and central office staff and administration from Angie and Eric, because Lexi started when Angie was there and continued with Eric being there. And, during our full-scale evacuation drill today, she was all about trying to get everyone, including Mr. Thomas, some love and attention during the day. So we're really lucky to have a school district and a school that allows us to be forward-thinking and pay attention to what we can do to best serve the needs of our kids.
Great. Thank you so much. We have this certificate for you. Thank you. And
That brings us to our visitor comment section of the agenda. As Vicki is bringing up a list of those who have signed in, I will read the reminders that we usually state at the beginning of this section. The school board and administrative staff encourage and appreciate community interest in meetings of the Board of Education. This section of the agenda is designed to hear the views of community members about their schools and items on the agenda. Each speaker will be asked to address the board at the visitor's podium so that the speaker's remarks may be clearly heard. The speaker should give their name and street address and limit comments to a maximum of 5 minutes. Consistent with policy 9130 on public complaints, we ask that complaints about particular employees be referred to Dr. Bowers and not addressed during public session. We remind all speakers that our district values and respects all people as they are, and that our district is committed to creating and maintaining safe spaces for all of our students and community members. We value public input and always appreciate when our community members remember our district's values, refraining from using harmful or offensive language, and for sharing your comments in a civil and respectful manner. It is not our usual practice to respond to remarks during the visitors' comment section of our meeting. And with that, our first speaker. All right, that ends the visitor comment section of our meeting and brings us to section C, where we will review the cell phone survey data.
Okay, so thank you. So Mrs. Greenwald and I are going to kind of talk through community engagement on cell phones. So we know that earlier this year, Ohio Governor Mike DeWine signed legislation on cell phone use in school during school hours. So school districts have until July of 2025 to adopt new policy on cell phones. So in Worthington schools, we felt like before a policy was adopted, we wanted to gather feedback from our staff members, from our community members, our families who are engaged in this conversation, and then from our 9th through 12th grade students. So we ran some surveys with all three of those groups. When you think about cell phone conversation, a lot of it is being driven by this book, The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. Professor Haidt is a professor at New York University. And has talked about the role that cell phones are playing in American life. But really what he's talked about is that he feels like we are overprotecting our children in the physical world and underprotecting our students in the digital world. And that there's consequences on how we have evolved in the last 25 years. So we see that heavy social media use is linked to things like poor self-esteem, loneliness, body images. Adolescent girls report higher levels of distress. So the research would say that the social media does have different impacts on boys and girls in those teen years. Obviously, we all know that constant online social comparison and cyberbullying can be significant contributors. So we're dealing with these things in the modern digital world that previous generations haven't dealt with because these pieces didn't exist. And so Haidt's research would say that around 2012, 2014, we began to see this shift. And that correlation then is, when did most of our teenagers begin to have a smartphone? When did we have these tools at our disposal all the time? And because of, in that correlation, we see this significant increase, specifically with our teens, in anxiety and depression, in mental health struggles, right? Now, like any research, social science research, there are critics of the research, right? And so there are those that would say, hey, this resonates with me, but we should really dig into the data, those types of pieces. But I think what we would say in a school district is we have seen, or we have concerns that during a school day, these devices create distractions, right? No question. So we have concerns about that. We also care deeply for our kids, and we want to make sure that we are raising healthy young adults, and want to be mindful of how much time our students are spending in front of screens. And what does that mean? So Haidt had 4 recommendations in the book, and so one of them was no smartphones before high school. Obviously a parent recommendation, something that parents have to grapple with. One being no social media before 16, again in that same realm of a parent piece. But one is phone-free schools. And so Haidt would say that our students need 7 hours a day where they're not connected to their social media. And his presupposition is, when they have that, there's a period of time that's hard, but then what they realize is most of the people they want to communicate also don't have their phones. And so because of that, they begin to talk to one another and they have those interactions. And when we're having more face-to-face interactions, we're gaining more skills that we don't gain when we're looking at a screen, right? We're conflict skills, cooperation skills, social skills, these things that we're concerned about. And then the fourth one, again, has some school impact and also has some parent impact, but more outdoor play and independence, right? So school districts are having to think about, okay, how do we build that independence into our school days? How do we get kids outside more, right? It's not outdoor play, but it's one of the things about our new high schools that we're all excited about, is that ability to be outside in outdoor eating spaces, potentially phone-free or, with some limited phone access, conversing with one another. So I bring up the height piece, not because it drives really our decisions, but because it is kind of the driver of the legislation that you see both in Ohio and a lot of places across the country. So if you haven't had a chance yet to dig into the book, The Anxious Generation, it is a fascinating read, as we're all trying to figure out, okay, I'll say my generation, I have children that are 22 and 20 and 18, and we gave our kids smartphones pretty early and didn't, had some concerns, but now we would say, would I do it the same way again? I don't know, right? And so that's the conversation we're having in America. So that drives this thought process as we think about policy. So what we did in Worthington was we used a tool called Thought Exchange, and we wanted to make sure that, again, our parents had an opportunity to give their feedback, our staff members had an opportunity to give their feedback, and our 9th to 12th grade students had an opportunity to give their feedback. And Mrs. Greenwald's going to kind of talk us through what those results showed.
So I want to kind of give you a high-level overview of the process and the results, and then we have a full report of those things for all of you that we can share after this presentation, and that we'll make available. But I'll first begin with our student participation and just give you an indication of kind of what we saw. So we had 20,091 students participate in grades 9 through 12. So that represents about 2/3 of our high school students. We have about 3,200 students in our high schools. We provided dedicated time at our 2 traditional high schools at Linworth and Worthington Academy for students to participate in the Thought Exchange in the middle of September. Questions were based on what is your grade level, how often do you bring your phone to school, how often do you use your phone, most common reason for use, and so on. So we asked a set of general questions, and then we had an open-ended questions. What thoughts, concerns, or recommendations do you have about cell phone use in schools? And so we did the same with our families. So we had about 2,500 parents who participated. Same questions, what are the ages of your children? Because we are focused on high school in this presentation, we did have 1,023 high school parents respond. And then we also asked the same of our staff. So same questions, what grade levels do you teach, and how do you feel about cell phone use? And again, because we're focused on high school, I will point out that we had 150 staff members participate of the 462. So we'll start with our themes from our students. And these were the top 5 themes: emergency use, educational use, responsible or policy flexibility, student responsibility, and distraction concerns. So again, we said we had about 2,000 students participate. 94% of them say they bring their phones to school daily. And the most common reason is 84% said communication with family. So when we look at our top thoughts from our students, they said we should be able to have our phones during downtime or academic prep because we may not have anything else to do. That's what they shared with us. I find that hard to believe, but our students did indicate that they would like to have their phones. So top of mind for them is emergency use. They do indicate that they have concerns about having the ability to access their phone for an emergency. Now, they also, within emergency, talk about things like contacting home, looking at sports schedules and things like that. So emergency is a broad term, but students did indicate emergency use was important. They also talked about educational use. So our students said that they use their phones at teacher discretion. They like to look things up. And they also indicated that they do understand it's important to restrict phone use during lessons. I should note that many of the things that they talked about in terms of phone use can be completed on the district-provided laptops that we do give to each of our students. And then our students also talked about policy flexibility. So you'll see the term policy used with parents, with students, and with staff. Students talked about flexibility. So what students would like is to have the use of their phones during downtime, such as academic prep or during lunch. But they also talked about having phones being regulated, not prohibited, and that was important to them. And they discussed teaching and learning about responsible use of phones and not just banning them altogether. So next we'll talk about our family themes. Again, we had 2,500 participants, 1,000 of which were from high school parents. The most common reason, again, that parents cited was that students use their phones to communicate with families. Their top thought, however, was that phones should be turned off without teacher permission unless there's an emergency. So again, our families cite that same emergency. Again, our families talked about distraction from learning. These are their top 5: mental health concerns, emergency use, policy consistency, and social interaction being important to them. So when we look at distraction, 82% of our families said that that was a primary concern for them, was distraction from learning. They feel like our students need to have social interactions as well, and that may not be happening if they have their phones out, and they do believe it detracts from teaching and learning. When we also look at families, they talked about mental health as a top concern. They feel like we should put limits in place that kids are not putting in place themselves. 69% of our families responded with either negative or very negative in terms of the impact of phones on mental health at school. And then finally, our families again talked about emergency use. They expressed a concern about distraction, but they also said that they felt that emergency use of phones was important for their kids while they're at school. We had one respondent that said, I think use in class should be prohibited unless during an emergency. And another said, in case of an emergency, I want my kid to have his phone. So again, those themes are pretty consistent between parents and students. And then our staff, we had 462 participants. Again, 150 were high school staff members. Their top thought was that a consistent cell phone policy would be helpful. So the top themes with our families are distraction, mental health, responsible use, policy enforcement, and social interaction. And so when we look at distraction, 89% of our staff cited distraction from learning as a primary concern. Among the staff, some suggest a complete ban while others ask for appropriate use. So even within the staff, there's a little bit of difference in opinion about what's appropriate. But much like parents, the staff have concerns about distraction with teaching and learning. And then our staff also agree that mental health is a concern. 87% of our staff indicated they felt that it had a negative impact. Cell phone use at schools had a negative impact on our students during the school day. And so they feel we should help our students develop impulse control and put those guardrails in place so that students can focus and hopefully have a healthy environment to learn in. And then finally, our staff also indicated responsible use, and this aligns with their concerns with policy. They talk about consistent policy, but within consistent policy, they want us to make sure that kids understand how and when to adhere to the policy and how and when to use their phones responsibly. So they talked about, had a comment that said, we have to teach kids to be responsible. When is it appropriate and when is it not? They need to learn to use wisely and appropriately. Another respondent said they need to teach students to use responsibly. So our staff, as always, are teachers, and they want to make sure that we're teaching our kids responsible use in addition to just adhering to consistent policies. So when we talk about actionable items or things to look at, we pulled together consistent themes in our feedback. And I'm going to switch papers so I can read a little easier here. They talked about allowing phones for emergency. That was a theme that came across from students and families, and staff even indicated that on a few responses. They talked about prohibiting cell phone use during class time. That is something that is currently in place at our high schools. Our middle schools have phones banned throughout the school day. They talked about teacher discretion for phone use in class, and that came through from students and families. Students, staff, and families talked about educating students on responsible use. Staff and family talked about consistent policies across classrooms. Parental communication was important to students, staff, and families. Face-to-face interaction or social interactions was important to staff and families. And focus on mental health and social development was important to students, staff, and families. So our current policies are here, and if you cannot see those, I'll read those to you, but our elementary and middle schools are fairly consistent with students having their phones or smartwatches stowed in backpacks or in lockers. So our middle schools have lockers for every student. At our high school, I should say stowed during the school day, throughout the school day, without use. At our high schools, our students have access to their phones between classes, during lunch, and during academic prep. But during class periods, phones are to be put away, powered off, or silenced in backpacks. We don't have lockers for every student in our high schools, and due to size, that it wasn't practical. So we, of course, have our students carrying their phones at present, but they are currently turned off and away during class times. So with that, I will open it to questions.
Thanks, Emily. If you guys don't mind, I'll just start by asking, based upon the feedback, both from family, staff, and students, and our current policy, are there any obvious changes that you would recommend?
I think our current policy at our middle schools is working well. I think our current policy at our high schools is new this year. And so we probably need to dig in a little bit. Now, I will say from what I have heard, and I've spoken with our principals and with some of our teachers, they are happy with where we are currently, which is banned during classes. Last year, we had what we kind of referred to as the stoplight, so red, yellow, green, and it was a little hazy for students at times. So red was no use within the classroom, yellow was at teacher discretion, and green might have been, there are 5 minutes left of class, you're working independently, you can have your phone on, or you can put your AirPods in and listen to music. We felt like that was a little inconsistent from classroom to classroom as to the yellow versus green. Red was very easy. And so this year, the high schools went to no phones during class time. So bell to bell, there is no phone out in the classroom. And then students have access to it during other times like lunch and hall passing. Right now, our principals feel like that's working fairly well, but I would be interested to ask our students and staff how we're doing with that as we progress through the year.
Okay.
So to answer your question, right now, I think it's working well. Our current practice is working well.
Okay, and given that the policy committee will look at this over the winter to be prepared by the summer to pass as is required, although we have a policy, so I think we're compliant, actually. I'm just wondering, should we revisit it mid-year, after, half of the year with regards to from a survey standpoint? Should we give it a full year just to understand whether or not anything needs to change?
I think it would be fine to survey and have those conversations with our staff, especially to see if it's working, to see if kids are keeping their phones away, if it's still a distraction when it's in their backpack, in their, within the classroom. When we made the change this year, I think it was a welcome change because it did tighten things up and make it clearer for students. And I just think we're early on in the year. Last year, for example, when we went to that red, yellow, green, the school administration and union representation, our WEA representatives, and I met multiple times to have conversations about what was working and what wasn't. And part of what helped inform moving forward with this year was those conversations and really revisiting throughout the year. So we had multiple conversations last year, and our WEA was a really great partner with us in having conversations with their membership so that we could inform this year's practice. So I think it would be helpful.
I think it'd be fair to say that we feel like distraction from cell phones during class periods has lessened significantly at the high school with our current practice. I think what the board will need to think about moving forward would be that social interaction piece. And how do you value that, say, in hallways or in lunch times, right? Because obviously, if we have our phones during lunch, there's less social interaction. Now, that's a big move, right? I'm not saying that that's the direction that Worthington needs to go, but I do think that's kind of maybe the question on the table moving forward, that we'll have to tackle by summer.
That's helpful. I would also say this policy in and of itself, I would think isn't the full universe of what we do. And if we go back to those beginning recommendations, it included education on responsible use, and that seems to be a theme throughout all of the survey responses. So regardless of whether or not the policy is tweaked, it seems like it would behoove us to think about how we engage our students in a conversation related to responsible use. I mean, let's be candid, this is a space where even adults struggle, right, with regards to screen time. So if we can raise a generation that's better equipped in this space where we all benefit. So I would just encourage us to take those two things hand in hand and it not just be policy driven, but also some type of education in that space as well. Let me open it up to my fellow board members. Stephanie, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I wrote down very similar comments, so
Okay.
thank you. Because I do think there's a education versus policy piece. And ultimately, what the long-term goal is, like you said. I'm going to step back a second, and I know we're only talking about high school right now, but I feel like I read the beginning of The Anxious Generation, and then it sat down in my chair, and it's still resting. It'll open up again. But a lot of what you covered, Trent, at the beginning, I have gotten through. And I want to tie something together here because one of the pieces, number 4, more outdoor play and independence. Again, I know we're talking about high school, but let's talk about everybody for just a second. That's a huge equity piece for families, right? And so if we as a district have the opportunity to provide that for kids that may or may not have that in other spaces, I think that's something that's really important and that we should really lean into heavily because I do think that's incredibly important. And there's tons of data around just education in general and SEL and all of that stuff, all those things you gain from independence from being outside. So off the soapbox. Have we looked yet at the legislation that's coming to kind of get a gauge? I'm assuming we're already in compliance, or do we know where we are with our current policy and how we stand? Either of you.
Yeah, Steph, the answer is I don't know that answer.
Okay.
And I probably should.
Okay.
I'd have to compare what we have from a policy standpoint to what's coming. I do believe if we codified our current practice into policy, we're
Okay.
absolutely in compliance.
That's really
more my question.
I don't have any
Yeah.
question about that. I just don't.
Okay.
I haven't reviewed our policy versus what our practices are. Our practices are currently more restrictive than
Yeah, and
what we
actually,
would have in policy. And
yeah. I'm glad you reframed it that way because I think that was actually my question was what we're doing today, and we'll revisit the overall efficacy, but what we're doing today is probably in alignment with what the state is requiring.
100%.
Okay.
Correct.
Yeah, I think those are my only questions right now.
Okay, thank you. Jennifer, do you want to go next?
Yeah. You mentioned in the elementary and middle school about the cell phones being put away in the day, but also smartwatches. Has that been going on this year too, that they're put away, or is that still?
Yeah, so that's
little
that's a great question. So our students currently still, in most cases, have smartwatches unless specific teachers have asked for them not to. We are going to shift practice at the elementary school and ask for smartwatches to remain in backpacks. Elementary principals are going to begin to communicate that with families. I want to stress there are always exceptions, right? So there are times where a student needs something, maybe it's on an IEP, maybe it's, we've already had those conversations. So, there will always be exceptions. But for the most part, when we talk with our teachers and our key communicators, those elementary teachers really feel like they're struggling with smartwatches. And so we're gonna work on that. We're not planning for a current change at the middle school. Again, feel like middle school is working pretty well. Although that's, because these are practices, if we feel like that shifts or we feel like smartwatches are something that needs to be more of a conversation at the middle school, then we'll move in that direction. But right now we are going to make a shift, K-5. Our teachers brought that up to us last spring pretty emphatically. to be truthful, it took me a while to really understand it, as not being an elementary parent anymore, like exactly what kid, how that was impacting them. We talked about it again here in September with our teachers and just feel like it will help them to be a little more consistent at that K-5. We do want to, I want to stress, many elementary parents would say, hey, I use that, my kid doesn't have a phone, that's tracking. Like I'm letting them walk to school, but I want to make sure they get there, those types of things. So they'd still have that ability. The phone would still be, or the smartwatch would still be on them, those types of pieces. But during school, we're going to ask that it remain in the backpack. So that shift's going to occur.
Thank you for that update. And then just one more question. Does our student discussion meetings with the high schoolers start up, I think, maybe next week? Are we going to talk a little bit about cell phone and how it's going this year? So we'll get to hear some of that direct from them. Great.
Maybe we'll hear why it's needed in academic assist.
Because if they have nothing to do, they have to play on their phone, I guess.
Kelly, would you like to share next?
Thank you, first of all. Thank you both. I love the consistency piece, because that I think is what I hear the most from parents is that, and students a little bit, of just not being clear about what the boundaries are. So even the stoplight thing was just kind of a gray area. And so the consistency piece I think will be key when looking at policy with what we have currently, and if we need to tweak that to just have more consistent language in it, and that it's, how many times can I say consistent? Okay. I will say under the consistency slide, it said 43.5, and so is that supposed to be 3.5?
I think it should say 3.5 stars.
That's okay. I just wanted to make sure. The survey was high school students, right?
Correct.
Would we consider surveying middle school students? And I ask that because for a number of years, they have had their devices away. And so they may have a different, it's fine, we're fine. We're good, whereas this is new for high school. And so they're adjusting to that change. But I'm wondering if we got some feedback from middle school students, if we get a little bit of a sense of how it's going, because it's been going for a number of years. And just even in key communicators, they were saying that the new, freshmen this year are handling it better because they're coming from that middle school space. And so I'm just wondering if I don't know how much work that is to put a survey out like that. So I say that with, understanding that that could be more than what I'm asking for. But I'm just wondering that. And then for the family piece, was that just high school families? And I probably should know this. Or was that all families?
No, it was deployed
Okay, so that was all
district-wide.
families. Okay. So just you're getting elementary parents. And so I just wonder if we could have that other piece to it. I think that was all my questions. I think they asked so. Thank you. This is helpful, very helpful.
It really was. And thanks for the work that went into and the collaboration with the WEA on creating a policy. And it's kind of nice to be ahead of the curve, right? So I know that work was being done even before the new law went into place. So that's great.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? All right. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Kelly.
I love the logistics. Okay, next steps. So it says winter. So we just talked about our next policy meeting, but should we look 2025 to maybe look at that? Okay, just to have it on the radar.
No, that's part of the reason why I asked Emily. If it seems like something that we survey mid-year, and then it goes to the policy committee based upon those results, and potentially, sharing obviously with all of us. But if there's not a drastic change, then potentially what the policy committee is doing is merely codifying our current practices.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Dr. Bowers, that brings us to the superintendent's report.
Awesome, thank you. So our mission in Worthington Schools is to empower a community of learners who will change the world. We do that through our 4 vision statements. Our first vision statements, we will engage each student with diverse opportunities to maximize every student's potential. So last week on October 8th was our PSAT administration for sophomore and junior students at both of our high schools that signed up to take the test. We had excellent participation, so this is optional. 372 students at Thomas Worthington and 408 students at Worthington Kilbourne signed up to take the PSAT. This spring, all of our juniors, all of them, will take the SAT at school. So just a reminder that we made the switch for this year from the ACT to the SAT. So that'll happen this spring. So excited about that. Second, our second vision statements will provide a safe environment where every student can grow intellectually, emotionally, socially, and physically. All of our Worthington schools are participating in full-scale safety drills between October 7th and October 22nd. That happened today at Worthington Kilbourne High School, so some people saw all of our students out front at Worthington Kilbourne High School. These drills represent an important part of our ongoing commitment to school safety. They're in collaboration with local law enforcement and fire and EMS from Columbus, Perry Township, Sharon Township, and the city of Worthington. We've reviewed our plans to ensure they meet the highest safety standards. These agencies have also reviewed our plans and then been invited to observe the drills at each of our buildings, providing valuable feedback to help us make necessary adjustments, enhancing both safety and efficiency. So that cooperation with local law enforcement is very appreciated. So a full-scale drill is an immersive type school safety exercise required under Ohio law, and the drill requires us to evacuate the building to a designated rally point and then test our real-time response in each of our buildings. Ahead of the drills, we shared schedules with each building, communicated with parents through email and newsletters, provided guidance for communicating the event to students, and we've reinforced with our teachers and principals the importance of using student-friendly language when discussing these exercises, hoping to ensure that all students understand the purpose while also minimizing their anxiety. So we are about halfway through those drills, but those will continue over the next couple weeks. Our third vision statements will provide consistent communication and promote dialogue with our community. It is Parent-Teacher Conference Week, so most of our parent-teacher conferences are scheduled this week, October 14th through 17th. We routinely get most of our parents to attend in Worthington. These meetings serve as an important way to connect with families and to build partnerships that support student learning. Our goal is 100% attendance in the elementary conferences, and that all middle and high school families feel welcome and have a conference when they want one. Our hope is that each teacher will be able to be welcoming, share progress, communicate a plan, be positive, show that they care, and leave room for parent questions. So that's happening this week. And then fourth, we'll be responsible and transparent with our community resources. Friday, October 18th, that's this Friday, is our Worthington Educational Support Professional Development Day. Students and our certified staff members, so students and teachers do not report to school, so there's no school on Friday. Our support staff will participate in a full day of professional learning at Worthington Kilbourne High School. So we have a great day of learning planned for this Friday. Super excited about that. And this week, this Thursday, is the end of the first quarter of this school year. So the second quarter officially begins Monday, October 21st. President Hudson, that's my report.
Thank you. Time flies, doesn't it? TJ, would you like to share the treasurer's report? I should ask, any questions or comments? I think we usually jump in. Yeah, go ahead. I'm glad I asked.
Just one question about the safety drills. That's like a once every 3 year kind of thing,
That is
right?
correct.
We don't
That's
do this every year.
Once every 3 years required by law. Our plans do go to local law enforcement and Homeland Security every year. But this partners together with those local groups, and we do those evacuation drills to rally points once every 3 years. Jeff Maddox is doing a great job of leading that work with Tracy Winiger, and just really, again, the biggest piece, obviously, you're talking massive logistics and getting fire and EMS and police, and today at Worthington Kilbourne, 1,800 students and all those kind of things. So.
I'll ask a follow-up question to that. You referenced the student-friendly language that's used during drills, obviously age-appropriate. Just curious, do you know if that language is shared with families? I think it's
a good question. I don't know the answer to what specifically has been shared with families. There is parent communication that's drafted through Jeff's office that goes to families, but I don't know what exactly that
I
shows.
haven't
can,
seen, I have littles.
I can
haven't
find that.
seen the language itself, but I was going to say, my kids come and tell me, you know, what was said. But as a parent of still both elementary school kids who was more nervous about the drills and what that would mean for their anxiety than anything else. This is now the second time I've been through it and, you know, with 3 years and they're good. Like the teachers are doing a great job getting them places, but not, you know, escalating anything. But they understand that they need to go and follow the directions, but they're not. So kudos to everybody for doing that.
That's great to hear. Kelly, you had something as well. Yeah.
Well, one, I ran into the evacuation drill,
At Kilbourne?
and I was like, "Oh, it was okay. It was okay." I was like, "What's happening?" So I'm glad, you know, and from a community member perspective, it went very smoothly. The officer was directing traffic. We all had to make a nice little U-turn. It worked out well. So, but I was like, is this
1,800 students on the line.
Right, yeah, it's just okay. I had a question about the SAT in the spring. It's still this is no cost to families,
That's correct.
right? Okay,
That's correct.
making sure. That's all I have. TJ?
Right when I took a drink.
Of course. Happens that way sometimes.
Thank you. So time does fly, Mrs. Hudson. That will start me off. If you remember, at the beginning of this calendar year, I spoke at several meetings regarding a property tax reform subcommittee that was formed at the State House that is supposed to issue a report by the end of the year on any potential changes to property taxation in Ohio. Whether they do that or not is yet to be seen, but we are kind of in a quiet period legislatively as we approach the election, but we do anticipate after November 5th that there is some sort of push to implement potential property tax changes before the end of the calendar year, before property tax bills go out in December for 2025. There are multiple bills out there that are addressing property taxes that have already been introduced and are sitting in subcommittees. Most of them target changes to the 20 mil floor, what we call the 20 mil floor, which, as you know, about 2/3 of districts only have 20 mils of taxation. So when reappraisal hits, they get a lot of tax hit, a lot of growth in taxes when valuations go up. Worthington is not at the 20 mil floor. Districts around here mostly aren't. But nonetheless, that impacts over 400 districts. And so there's bills out there that may make changes to the 20 mil floor. Other bills that have been introduced attempt to implement some sort of cap on the annual increase in taxes that a homeowner faces, which could have some constitutionality issues with it. One bill in particular, 271, creates a circuit breaker for lower income individuals. We would be in favor of this approach because it essentially uses the income tax return to provide the revenue and the credit rather than the school district. So qualifying homeowner pays the property tax and then gets a credit on their income tax, which is paid for by the state, as opposed to other bills that would cap the increase and then just let the school district and local government out of the resources. So 271 as it stands now would be a positive measure that we would be in favor of. But in general, we can support some sort of circuit breaker approach as long as the school district is held harmless. So more to come after the election. Again, we're in this quiet period, but we will want to be able to act quickly as these things come out of committee, because as we've been through this before, many bills are likely to pass between November 5th and the end of the year, which could impact us considerably as a heavily property tax dependent school district. So kind of just wait and see, but that's what's out there. And that's all I really have for my report today.
Excellent. Thank you. Any questions or comments? Okay. Wonderful. That brings us to board committee reports and announcements. Would anyone like to go first?
I have a few. We haven't had committee meetings
I
and
know.
things for so long. It's like, oh, wait. I have a lot of things. First off, I want to just talk about, mention an email that came today from the Chamber of Commerce, because so often those go to people's spam and they don't see them, but they're having their elected officials recognition evening on Thursday, November 7th from 5 to 6:30. most of our administrators and board members should have that email with the detail on that, because I know our district's always had a really good turnout at those events. Next is my library trustee search update. Library, as you know, every year adds a new trustee to their board, and one goes off, always keeping it at 7. They have one that is most likely moving out of the district this year, so they may be replacing 2 board members. We may have 2 names coming up the end of November, but they are very excited because they had 18 people apply for these open seats, which is kind of record-breaking for them. They're going to interview 10 of them over the next few weeks, so they've got some very good candidates that they're really pleased with. So then they will keep in touch with me and also with TJ about who they have chosen. It'll be on their November board meeting, which is the 3rd week of the month. So our second meeting in November, that 4th week. We should have the names on our agenda, and I will have given you all information about who they chose and why. Get that, try to keep everybody as updated as I can on that. And then we had our AAPL meeting last week, and with Angie and her team, it's always, well, you know, Kelly, it was terrible. You wouldn't have liked it at all.
A little jealousy at this end of the table. Yeah.
I know Kelly would really like to be there at the meeting, so.
One of us is gonna have to miss it just so she can sub.
I know, so that she can, get all the updates. But we had a great meeting. They talked about some of their goals for the year and where they stand on their goals. So I'm going to talk about a couple things, and then I'll pass it over to Stephanie to talk. But they talked about decreasing the chronic absenteeism, which is, great that we have that goal, because we see it so often that that's an issue just in education everywhere. And they are doing a lot of deep dives into our data that they get from our EMIS reports. And they're using our VisEd program to really dive into this. And so this is the second time at these meetings we've talked about the VisEd program for the absenteeism, and we talked about it, about reading and how to really connect with where are the students missing out. So I think, Angie, are we having a board update on VisEd using data in November? I think
Is it November?
I think it's mid-November. Yeah. Yes. That the whole board is going to see this program and how they can really dive into the data and make great decisions. So we talked about that. We talked a little bit about the special ed audit. Our group is still working with our consultant that we had, and they have 3 coalition groups of 20 teachers each that are looking at the various options, which that's a lot of teachers involved in this. So that's very exciting that we have that many involved, and they're going to give us a board update in January, I believe. Okay, so that's all I have, so I'm going to pass it off and let Stephanie go next, because she has the second half of our meeting.
Okay. I have so many notes, so I hope I don't forget anything, but the data is so cool. And I'm a data nerd, so the data is cool in and of itself, but stepping back and just thinking about the implications of not having to have in your brain or on a piece of paper, back to this can we search it thing, trends, and see the trends before they become a problem it's huge. And I think it's super exciting. It was exciting for me to see, and I think you guys will love it when we see it, but it's awesome. Okay, so we also talked about, did an update on the ELA legislation, so everybody knows science of reading, which is great. But we are piloting at the elementary school 2 different programs, not all elementary schools, just at the elementary school level. And so before next year, probably in early 2025, we'll have a recommendation will come to the board. So we'll be able to see what they've piloted. But or what they're recommending based on their pilot. But the feedback for both programs so far is good, it sounds like. It's a change, right? So that's a heavy lift for any teacher that has to change their curriculum. So it's a big ask, but they're already seeing the benefits to the students. So, and anecdotally, I've heard it's great too from people that I know in the district. So I'm excited about that. Obviously, we always want, reading is the foundation of everything, right? So if we don't get it going at the elementary level, we're going to have problems on, further on. And so anything we can do to shore up that is amazing. And also the fact that the state has funded a lot of this and a lot of the professional development is huge. So, so we had an update on that. And then we had an update from Toya on a lot of the DEI work that they're doing, and talked a lot about the building champions. We have DEI champions in all the buildings. And one of the things that jumped out at me is that over 50% of the building champions have been there for the entirety of the program, which is great for everybody in the building, but says a lot about Toya's leadership in the program in general, that they want to stay and they're invested in it because it's more stuff for them to take on, and we know that they're already busy. So, so that was great. And so they're going to continue to try to strengthen that relationship between the building principals and the DEI champions in every building. And Miss Toya Reads continues, and it's aligned with Portrait of a Learner. So we're really getting some. I almost said synergies. I'm going to say it out loud, but not synergies, not corporate. But getting a lot of integrating everything together, right? So we have consistency across the district, and we're all using the same language and things like that. So that's really exciting too. And I know that is really easy for me to sit up here and say that, but that takes a whole lot of work to get all of that stuff aligned. So kudos to everybody that was involved in that. Okay, I'm going to set that aside. Did I miss anything?
Nope, I think that
Okay.
was it.
In addition to that, just a few small things. I wanted to say again that I really enjoyed our working session because it was really nice to have an opportunity to have a board meeting that was a little bit longer, that we could talk about what we have going on and kind of just get a gauge for where everybody is. So thank you for that. It was really cool to see Thomas. I hadn't had the opportunity to go inside yet, and so the open house was great. It's a beautiful space. Like I said at one of the meetings earlier, I feel like we have the opportunity to really make students feel welcome and at home, and that's a big deal. And then finally, this is not really board related, but it is a little bit. I had the opportunity to go to the Kaleidoscope Youth Center 30th Anniversary Gala, and I bring that up because they have been providing programming for kids throughout Central Ohio, LGBTQIA plus kids and their families, and continue to do so. So I know that we have families in the district that take advantage of those programs. So it was really wonderful to see a celebration of those families and those programs, and to help them raise money for hopefully another 30 years of programming, because we know that there is unfortunately a great need there in Central Ohio. So that was wonderful, and that's it.
Excellent. Thank you. Kelly, would you like to go next?
Well, after all that enthusiasm, I am also enthusiastic. Let's see, my committee report. So I attended Key Communicators. So that's our internal and external key communicators. And so Trent talked a lot about student enrollment and how we're kind of at a slow incline right at the moment. So he went into some details about that. Also used the thought exchange ahead of time. So Vicki and Trent are trying to do a couple of things differently a little bit, just to get a better engagement and understanding of what those community members and teachers want to gain from our conversations. And so they did that thought exchange. So that was kind of neat. So then we could see what the questions were, what the concerns were. It was kind of rated. Is that right? They were rated in a way. So I think you shared some of those topics with us. Though one of the slides is real small. So, okay. We talked about cell phones, feedback, and next steps. That's just so helpful. That's how I got the middle school understanding. We got information about smartwatches and how that impacts elementary levels. So it's really good to have. I appreciate that we have those two groups that we can get feedback from, and just like their boots on the ground, right? And so they know what's happening in spaces where we may not know the details of what's happening. So appreciate that time. Thomas was beautiful. I'm glad the weather held out. It was a beautiful evening. It was a little warm. But it was just beautiful. And the enthusiasm of the students, and just that so many community members came out to come and see. And you said retired teachers came back. And so I just think that's great. It just like, this community enthusiasm was just wonderful. I went to, Jennifer and I attended Trent's coffee conversation this past Friday, right? And so that was really good. Dr. Bowers is doing different locations this year, which I like too. And one is the evening of the 7th, but we'll make it in time. And so that's the next coffee conversation, which will be here at the WEC. So that was just good, again, to have that interaction with community members, for us, even us at the table, to engage our board members and staff that are there, to just really sit down and have just good conversation. So I appreciate that. And then we had policy before this, which we'll probably talk about separately. And that's all I have.
Excellent. I actually thought we would talk about it now. I mean,
Okay.
it
I
should
didn't
be
know if you
part
had
of our-
something
no.
before that.
The only other update I have is that I would recommend, separate and apart from policy, I'd recommend that you take a look at the Worthington Education Foundation's website. They are still in the process of relaunching. They have their new logo out there, ability to apply for a grant, which has been there the entire time, but they are making some great, significant, some good progress on the relaunch and the plans to have, to bring back that community event towards the end of January. So that's exciting news. So if you haven't done so recently, take a look at their website, which is thewef.org.
It's thewef.org.
THEWEF.org. Which does bring us to policy. As Kelly mentioned, we had a policy meeting before tonight's board meeting, recognizing that we have had public comment both for and against our policy 5223, release time for religious instruction. Kelly and I talked about the need to, or the recommendation that we as a board have a substantive discussion about that policy. Whether or not there's anything that we want to change with the policy, whether or not we feel like we want to keep the policy. And then we also talked about some things that we would want in place to ensure that we had a substantive discussion and a productive discussion in that space. So we will make sure that everyone receives a copy of our current policy, also a copy of Neola's kind of template for that policy. So you'll see what we adopted several years ago, what we actually added to the policy. I will say I didn't even realize this was here. There's a sentence that says, no solicitation for attendance at religious instructions shall be permitted on district premises. Obviously, that is contrary to our back to school events. And so we will consult with our attorneys to understand, does our policy need to change? Does our practice need to change? What does that need to look like? But then in addition to that, I asked that we ask LifeWise for a copy of their curriculum. I don't necessarily believe that whatever we decide in this space should be entirely based on the curriculum. It's a policy as a whole that needs to be evaluated, especially in light of resources that are used from public education. And at the same time, there have been comments made related to LifeWise being anti-LGBTQ+, anti-divorced parents. And I made the statement during policy that, I think it's very hard to say that when a student is pulled from school and if they are shared such messages and then pulled back into school, that when it occurs during the school day, it arguably legitimizes that those statements, and those statements can run and be in conflict with the environment that we strive to create for a welcoming and opening environment for all of our students and all of our families. So if they are sharing their curriculum, that is something that we should all receive prior to the meeting. And then Kelly, do you want to talk about the different pathways we talked about going forward?
Yeah, so I was just saying, I just said in policy, just different districts have done different things, right? And so over time, having not had this conversation, I don't know familiarity of that you are with it. So there are some districts that, because this is an optional policy, right now we don't have to have a policy. And so there are districts that never have had the policy. There are districts that do have the policy and just leave it as is. There are districts that have the policy and then have additional guidelines within the policy. 'Cause it just says you have to, you may, shall, may have a policy, right? And so within that policy, just like we added language, we can add language to our policy. So there have been districts that have done that have set boundaries, parameters, different things like that. There have been districts that have rescinded the policy years ago. And then there are, you've seen districts that have done it. So there are options. All that to say, I just wanted to outline that a little bit, but all that to say that there are options, right? And so I think it's just our due diligence to, when you're hearing feedback, regardless, support, not support, it's our due diligence to have conversation about it. It's our due diligence to look to see in Worthington, what do we need to do with the policy that we have? What are our next steps? And so we just talked about like having a conversation as a full board, obviously with Amber not being here, and we want to provide information ahead of time. So I feel like the policy committee is an information gatherer. So we've gathered information to be able to give to the entire board so that we can make an informed decision about whatever the next steps are and have a conversation about it. So that conversation doesn't necessarily have to happen today, again, in light of Amber not being here. And we want to make sure that we have that full board. I think that.
Yeah, I think we should be very clear about when we schedule the discussion, the substantive discussion for the next meeting when Amber is here, that's not a first reading of any proposed changes. That is a discussion. That is where we talk about what are our paths forward. I think we're all aware that there's proposed legislation at the State House that would change the may to a shall and require school districts to have this policy. So we can talk about if we are potentially interested in rescinding it, do we wait and see what happens at the State House and make a statement that we're doing that to determine what's the path is going to be required, what path is going to be required or set forth by the state legislature, or do we go ahead and make a change and then whatever happens there happens there? I mean, there are various things options in going forward, but it should be very clear to our community that we will have a substantive discussion about it at our next meeting. We will not make decisions at our next meeting. Or we will not vote on anything, I guess I should say, at our next meeting. Maybe we'll align on something and then we'll take action from there. Yeah.
Okay. And I know our next meeting is kind of full with a presentation next time. So I would think maybe that Wednesday meeting after OSBA that we had that discussion and give us time, but just for
I don't
the
feel
sake of time.
strongly. It doesn't anyone else feel?
I agree
since we
with
put the
Kelly. I think our
presentation?
next meeting, we have a lot of discussion on important items. I think if we waited for this, and then you have time to gather and for us to read and gather our thoughts.
Okay, so we'll slate it for the Wednesday meeting.
13th.
I was gonna say, what is the date again?
13th.
November 13th, okay.
13th.
Yeah, I think that's better. And that gives us, I think, some time to read through things and be thoughtful about it. Yeah, I agree.
Okay, excellent. Then we'll put it on the agenda for that meeting.
And on the agenda as a discussion.
As a
with no-
discussion,
yes.
exactly.
No action taken.
And when there is action, I mean, it would be a policy change, which would come through 2 meetings if we get to that.
That
point.
is accurate, yes. There would be a first reading and a second meeting, which is our standard process for policy change. Yes.
Great, thank you.
Right. Okay. That brings us to Dr. Bowers.
Oh, minutes.
Oh, approval of minutes. I'm sorry, TJ. Sorry. Skipping right over our minutes.
That's all right. My computer died, so I'm flipping pages. Thank you. I'd like to recommend that the board approve the minutes from the September 27th work session as presented in enclosure E1, please.
So moved.
Second.
Any questions or comments regarding the minutes? Seeing none, would you please call for the vote?
Ms. Harless.
Yes.
Mrs. Hudson.
Yes.
Mrs. Best.
Yes.
Mrs. Davis.
Yes.
Thank you. Motion carries. Now, Dr. Bowers.
Thank you. I'd like to recommend that the Board of Education approve the consent agenda. The consent agenda is items F2 through F8 on your agenda. Items F2 through F8, please.
So moved.
Second.
Any questions or comments? Would you please call for the vote?
Mrs. Hudson.
Yes.
Mrs. Best.
Yes.
Mrs. Davis.
Yes.
Ms. Harless.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. I'd like to recommend that the Board of Education approve item G1. Item G1 is the acceptance of the donations that are listed on your agenda. G1, please.
So moved.
Second.
Questions or comments? Would you please call for the vote?
Mrs. Best.
Yes.
Mrs. Davis.
Yes.
Ms. Harless.
Yes.
Mrs. Hudson.
Yes.
Thank you. I'd like to recommend that the Board of Education approve item G2. Item G2 is the recommended motion to approve the continued enrollment of a Worthington Kilbourne High School senior. G2, please.
So moved.
Second.
Questions or comments? Would you please call for the vote?
Mrs. Davis.
Yes.
Ms. Harless.
Yes.
Mrs. Hudson.
Yes.
Mrs. Best.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. I'd like to recommend that the Board of Education approve item G3. Item G3 is the recommended motion that the board approve the architect recommendation for award of the bid for the food service equipment at Thomas Worthington High School. Item G3, food service equipment for the new Thomas Worthington High School, please.
So moved.
Second.
Questions or comments regarding the bid? Please call for the vote.
Ms. Harless.
Yes.
Mrs. Hudson.
Yes.
Mrs. Best.
Yes.
Mrs. Davis.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. I'd like to recommend that the Board of Education approve item G4. Item G4 is a revised impractical busing resolution to Bridgeway Academy. Item G4, please.
So moved.
Second.
Questions or comments? Would you please call for the vote?
Mrs. Hudson.
Yes.
Mrs. Best.
Yes.
Mrs. Davis.
Yes.
Ms. Harless.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. I'd like to recommend that the Board of Education approve item G5. Item G5 is also a revised impractical busing resolution, this one to Bishop Watterson. G5, please.
So moved.
Second.
Questions or comments? Seeing none, would you please call for the vote?
Mrs. Best.
Yes.
Mrs. Davis.
Yes.
Ms. Harless.
Yes.
Mrs. Hudson.
Yes. Motion carries.
Thank you. I'd like to recommend that the Board of Education approve item G6. Item G6 is an impractical busing resolution to Grace Academy. Item G6, please.
So moved.
Second.
Questions or comments? Would you please call for the vote?
Mrs. Davis.
Yes.
Ms. Harless.
Yes.
Mrs. Hudson.
Yes.
Mrs. Best.
Yes.
Thank you. Motion carries. That brings us to request questions or concerns from the board. Any tonight? Okay. And then our calendar. Obviously, we have what we were discussing. We have our kindergarten update during our October 28th meeting. And then we'll have using data to drive instructional decisions, which I'm very excited and look forward to, obviously on the 13th. And then our 5-year forecast on the 25th. And just note for our public, we referenced it earlier, the November 13th meeting is on a Wednesday, which is different than our normal schedule. Any questions or concerns regarding the calendar? All right. There being no further business, I could have a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Would you please call for the vote?
Mrs. Best.
Yes.
Mrs. Davis.
Yes.
Ms. Harless.
Yes.
Mrs. Hudson.
Yes. Motion carries. Have a good night, everyone. Thanks for joining us.